While wearing the old wedding dress for the last time, she found a hidden letter, and what was written changed everything she knew about her husband. The room was filled with laughter and lively voices. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the perfume of the guests, while the golden candlelight danced on the walls. Elowen looked around, observing Cedric's friends and colleagues gathered to celebrate his birthday. The night seemed perfect. Soft music, flowing wine, and compliments for the man everyone regarded as an admirable figure. "You are truly an exemplary wife, Elowen," said one of the guests, raising her glass toward her. "Cedric is a lucky man." Elowen smiled, but she felt the edge of an unease that she had been unable to shake for days. The last few weeks had been marked by a subtle yet evident distance from Cedric. He seemed more absent, more distracted. Small gestures like forgetting to ask about her day or appearing oblivious to the kids had left a mark. Even so, she suppressed her thoughts, telling herself it was just paranoia. As she walked through the room to check if everything was in order, she noticed Cedric's phone on the table. He rarely left it behind, which in itself was unusual. On impulse, she picked up the device, intending to take it to him, but as she unlocked the screen to see if there were any important notifications, something caught her eye. A message from the bank flashed on the screen. "Transfer completed. $50,000 to S. Roberts." Elowen felt her heart race. S. Roberts? She didn't recognize the name. Cedric had never mentioned anyone with that surname. Why had such a large sum been sent to this person? A knot formed in her throat, but she quickly placed the phone back where it belonged. This wasn't the time for questions, not in front of all those guests. "Are you okay?" asked Fiona, her best friend, noticing that Elowen's smile had faltered for a moment. "You seem a bit distracted." Elowen adjusted her tone, trying to sound casual. "I'm just making sure everything is perfect. Cedric deserves a special night." Fiona smiled, unaware of the hidden tension in her friend's words, and returned to chatting with another group. Meanwhile, Elowen stepped away to the kitchen where she could compose herself without being noticed. The message on Cedric's phone continued to burn in her mind. Who was S. Roberts? Why would he make such a significant transfer without mentioning anything? She returned to the room moments later, still wearing her rehearsed smile, but her attention was scattered. Toasts began, with Cedric at the center of attention. He raised his glass and thanked everyone, mentioning Elowen with warm words. "And, of course, to my incredible wife Elowen, without you none of this would be possible." The room erupted in applause, but Elowen felt that his words sounded hollow. As everyone laughed and drank, she analyzed every gesture of his, searching for a clue. Was it just her paranoia, or was something truly wrong? Later that night, after the last guest had left, Elowen began to tidy up the room. Cedric went upstairs, mentioning that he was exhausted. The house was finally quiet, but the unease inside her only grew. As she stacked glasses in the kitchen, she heard the muffled ringtone of Cedric's phone coming from upstairs. Curious, she slowly ascended the stairs, walking softly. When she approached the bedroom, she noticed the door was ajar. Cedric was sitting on the bed, phone to his ear. At first, his voice was low and indistinct, but as Elowen got closer, fragments of the conversation became clearer. "So I know I promised, but it's complicated right now. Elowen can't know anything." Elowen's heart raced. She froze in the hallway, her hands cold, gripping the railing. Cedric's tone was not just serious, it was almost pleading. "You have to trust me," he continued. "I've already made the transfer. This should solve it, at least for now." Elowen felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The mention of the transfer made her quickly piece together the clues. S. Roberts, the amount on the phone, the secret he was hiding from her. 1,000 questions surged in her mind. Who was this person? Why did Cedric seem so desperate? What was he hiding? Before Cedric could sense her presence, she quietly retreated down the hallway and descended the stairs. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter for support. His words echoed in her mind. "Elowen can't know anything." The phrase was an implicit confession of something deeper, something Cedric was doing behind her back. She stood there motionless, as the darkness of the house seemed to close in around her. Her thoughts spiraled out of control. Has my entire life been a lie? Is he cheating on me? Or is it something worse? Cedric came down minutes later, acting as if nothing had happened. He gave a slight smile and casually asked, "Are you okay? You look tired." Elowen forced a smile. "Just a bit, I'll finish up here and head to bed." He nodded and went back upstairs. As soon as she was alone, Elowen felt warm tears streaming down her face. The tension she had held throughout the night collapsed. She knew she needed answers. But above all, she knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The early morning dragged on with an unbearable weight. Elowen couldn't close her eyes. Cedric's words from the call hammered incessantly in her mind, like a heavy secret whispered in the dark. She didn't know what was worse, the possibility of betrayal or the feeling that her entire life had been built on a lie. Around 4 in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep. She got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and walked to the guest room, where she knew she could find some relief in silence. But peace did not come. Every corner of that house felt saturated with doubts and shadows. She decided she needed to occupy her hands to calm her thoughts, and began to reorganize the closet in the guest room. As she moved boxes and sorted through old clothes, Elowen found something she hadn't seen in years: her wedding dress. It was stored in a white fabric cover, pushed to the back of the closet, behind several winter shirts. As she pulled it out, a fine layer of dust rose into the air, making her sneeze. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the dress. Memories of that day flooded her mind. Cedric's smile as she walked down the aisle, the emotion in her father's eyes, the promises that felt so real. But now, each memory seemed tainted. Was that day really true? She wondered. Elowen took the dress out of the cover and laid it on the bed. The fabric was still stunning, a sea of white silk with delicate embroidery that seemed to capture the morning light. She ran her hand over the material, feeling the weight of the memories. Driven by a need to reconnect with who she was before, she decided to put it on. The dress still fit, though it was a bit tighter now, a decade and 2 kids later. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt a mix of nostalgia and sadness. But as she adjusted the dress, something strange caught her attention. There was an area on the inner hem that seemed poorly stitched, as if it had been hastily repaired. It was a detail she had never noticed before. Curious, she sat on the bed and began to examine the spot. The stitching was slightly loose, as if time had worn the thread down. Instinctively, she grabbed a small pair of scissors from the drawer and started to unravel the thread. With each strand pulled, Elowen's heart raced. What could be hidden there? When she finally opened the seam, a small envelope fell into her lap. The paper was yellowed but well preserved. On the front, the words, "For Elowen," were written in her father's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. The paper inside felt even more fragile, as if any touch could disintegrate it. The letter began with a warm tone, but something in the text sent a chill down her spine. "My dear Elowen, by the time you read these words, you will have begun a new life alongside Cedric. I know this day will be filled with joy and love, and nothing makes me prouder than seeing my daughter marry such an extraordinary man. But there is something I need to share with you, even if indirectly, as I did not have the courage to tell you in person." Elowen paused for a moment. Her father had always been a straightforward and pragmatic man, rarely hesitating to speak his mind. But here, in his words, there was an unusual hesitation. "Cedric and I made an agreement. He accepted certain conditions to ensure that our family would be protected from a shame that could destroy us. It wasn't easy for him, but Cedric is a man of character, and his decision showed how much he values you. I can never thank him enough for his loyalty." Air seemed to leave Elowen's chest. What agreement? She read on, searching for some clearer explanation, but the letter only grew more enigmatic. "The debts have been paid, both financial and of silence. All I wish is for you never to have to know the details of this sacrifice. Cedric is a rare man, and you are fortunate to have him by your side. Please trust him, even when it seems difficult." "Debts of silence," Elowen whispered. repeating the words as if they were a riddle. The letter concluded with a brief expression of gratitude, but offered no further details. Her father, even while alive, seemed determined to carry those secrets with him. Elowen carefully took off the dress and placed it back on the bed, but now she couldn't look at it the same way. What had once been a symbol of love and commitment now felt like a reminder of lies and secrets. Cedric hadn't mentioned anything about an agreement with her father. And what exactly did those debts of silence mean? What had Cedric done to warrant such gratitude? And above all, what was her father trying to protect? As the sun began to rise, Elowen tucked the letter away in her desk, promising herself that she would find answers. She knew this was just the beginning of a long journey to uncover the truth about the man she had married, and perhaps about herself. Before we dive deeper into Elowen's discovery and unravel the secrets hidden in her wedding dress, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment about your thoughts so far. It really helps the channel grow and brings more gripping stories like this to you. Now let's continue with the story. The morning had unfolded into a whirlwind of thoughts for Elowen. Her father's letter continued to echo in her mind like an unsolved riddle. Cedric and her father had made a deal, but at what cost? Who had been hurt for that perfect life to be built? She needed answers, but Cedric was still asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. Elowen sat at the kitchen table, stirring a cup of cold tea distractedly when she heard the doorbell. It was too early for visitors, especially after the party the night before. For a moment she hesitated, but the doorbell rang again, this time more insistently. Rising to her feet, she went to the door and opened it. On the other side stood a teenager. He looked to be about 16 or 17 years old, tall and thin, with slightly hunched shoulders. His brown hair was messy, as if he had traveled all night. A worn backpack hung from one shoulder, and his dark eyes, filled with determination, met hers. "Hi," he said, his voice a mix of nervousness and firmness. "I need to talk to Cedric." Elowen frowned. The boy seemed familiar in a strange way, but she couldn't place him. "Sorry, but who are you?" "My name is James," he replied, adjusting the strap of his backpack. I need to talk to him. It's important." Elowen felt a pang of distrust, but also curiosity. Why would a teenager be here asking for Cedric so early? "He's still sleeping," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Maybe I can help." James shook his head. "No, it's something he needs to hear from me." Before Elowen could respond, footsteps sounded from upstairs. Cedric, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked at James and froze. The color drained from his face, replaced by an almost frightening paleness. "James," he whispered, as if the name were a secret he never intended to say aloud. "Hi, Dad," James replied, crossing his arms, his posture hardening. "I came because I'm tired of being ignored." Elowen felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. Dad. That word resonated in her mind like an explosion. She looked at Cedric, hoping for an explanation, but he seemed paralyzed, as if he had just taken a blow. "Cedric," she said, trying to control her voice but failing. "What's going on here? Who is this boy?" Cedric slowly descended the stairs, his eyes never leaving James. When he reached the bottom, he stopped, as if carefully choosing his words. "Elowen, I can explain." "Then explain," she demanded, her voice louder than she intended. "Now." James interrupted before Cedric could respond. "I'm his son. He knows that, even if he's never acted like it." Elowen felt James's words hit her like a dagger. She looked at Cedric, searching for some sign that this was a mistake, but his defeated expression said it all. He knew. He had always known. "Since I was little," James continued, his voice trembling, "my mom tried to talk to you. She wrote letters, made calls, but you never responded. You pretended I didn't exist." Elowen felt a tightness in her chest. She thought of her father's letter. Debts paid with silence. Was this the secret he mentioned? She looked at Cedric, desperately hoping he would say something, anything to clarify the situation. "James, Cedric began, but his voice faltered. He looked as lost as Elowen felt. I don't want apologies, James cut him off. I just want you to stop hiding. You owe me that. Elowen took a step back, needing to lean against something. Cedric, you have a son, and you never told me. Since when did you know about this? Cedric ran his hands over his face as if trying to organize his thoughts. Since the beginning, he admitted, his voice low and filled with shame. Before we got married. Before we got married? Elowen repeated, her voice filled with incredulity. You knew you had a son all this time, and still let me believe our life was honest, clean. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Elowen's quickening breath. She looked at James, who now seemed more vulnerable than before. He wasn't there to destroy anything. He was there to demand something that was rightfully his. And I didn't know any of this, she thought. Why was I the last to find out? Why wasn't I told? Cedric finally broke the silence. Elowen, I didn't want you to know because I wanted to protect you. Protect both of us. Protect, she echoed, incredulous. Protect from what? The truth? It was complicated, Cedric continued, but she raised her hand, interrupting him. No, I don't want to hear that right now. I can't hear that right now. Elowen felt tears starting to form, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of James, not when he was the biggest victim of this whole situation. She took a deep breath, trying to regain some control. James, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, I'm sorry you went through this, truly. You deserve better than this. He nodded but didn't say anything. Elowen turned to Cedric, who was still standing like a statue, his eyes downcast. Cedric, you need to deal with this, she said, her voice filled with determination. You need to face him, because if you don't, I don't see how we can continue. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and definitive. Cedric finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, but he didn't respond. James, on the other hand, let out a small sigh, as if some of the weight he carried had been partially lifted. He had done what he came to do. Now it remained to be seen what Cedric would do next. Silence reigned in the living room as Cedric sat on the sofa, elbows resting on his knees, hands cradling his head. Elowen stood in front of him, arms crossed, her breathing heavy. Her eyes bore into him, searching for an explanation that could justify the devastation she felt. Start talking, Cedric, she said, firm yet laced with palpable pain in her voice. From the beginning, I want to know everything. Cedric sighed, raising his eyes to meet hers. There was something in his expression that Elowen had never seen before, shame. He seemed smaller, crushed under the weight of what he was about to confess. James is my son, he began, his voice low. I knew that before I met you. He was born from a relationship I had with Sarah, a woman I loved. These words hit Elowen like a punch. He loved. She felt a knot form in her throat but said nothing. She let him continue. Sarah was different, he explained, looking at the floor. She was humble but determined. I was at the beginning of my career, trying to establish myself, and she was one of the few people who believed in me. When she found out she was pregnant, I thought we could handle it. I thought we could figure it out, but... He paused, hesitating, and Elowen sensed he was choosing his words carefully. But what? She pressed. What happened? Cedric lifted his gaze to meet hers. Your father happened. Elowen blinked, confused. My father? What does he have to do with this? When I met you, Cedric continued, it was at a business event. Your father recognized my potential, saw that I could be useful for the family's interests, but he also found out about Sarah and James, and he gave me an ultimatum. Elowen felt her stomach churn. Each word he spoke made the letter from her father, found in the dress, seem even darker. He said that if I wanted a future with you, I needed to end my relationship with Sarah and keep James off the radar. He gave me money to ensure Sarah had enough to raise James, but made me promise that I would never publicly acknowledge my son. He said a scandal would ruin the family's business and destroy your reputation. Elowen placed her hands on her hips, shaking her head in disbelief. And you accepted that. You just agreed to abandon your own child for money and status." "It wasn't for money and status," Cedric said, his voice rising slightly but still heavy with guilt. "It was because I loved you, because I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I believed that by accepting your father's conditions, I was protecting James, Sarah, and you." Elowen laughed humorlessly, tears streaming down her face. "You call that protection? You call that love?" Cedric shook his head as if trying to explain the inexplicable. "I kept helping Sarah. I sent her money regularly to ensure James had a good life. But over time, she began to refuse my help. She said she wanted more than money. She wanted me to be a present father, not just a name on a check." "And why didn't you?" Elowen asked, her anger rising in her voice. "What stopped you from doing that?" Cedric looked at her, pain etched on his face. "Fear," he admitted. "Fear of losing you, of losing everything we built together. Fear that if you knew, you'd never forgive me." Elowen took a step back as if needing distance. "You've already lost, Cedric," she said, her voice trembling. "You lost because when you had the chance to be honest, you chose to hide. You chose your money, your reputation, over your family." Cedric lowered his head, unable to respond. Elowen walked to the window, looking out at the garden. Everything seemed so calm, so normal, but inside she felt as if she were in the midst of a storm. "I thought our marriage was built on trust," she said, more to herself than to Cedric. "I thought you were different." Cedric got up, trying to approach her. "Elowen, I'm not perfect. I made mistakes, yes, but everything I did was to protect you and our children." She turned to him, her face filled with pain. "And James? Who was protecting him? Who was there for him when he asked why his father never came to visit? You let him grow up thinking he wasn't worthy of your love. How can you live with that?" Cedric didn't answer. He knew there was no justification that could erase the mistakes he made. All he could do now was face the consequences. "I'm going to talk to Sarah," Elowen finally said, breaking the silence. Cedric blinked, surprised. "What?" "I need to hear her side of the story," Elowen explained, crossing her arms, "because clearly, you only told me half of it. If you think I'm just going to accept all of this without questioning it, you're very mistaken." "Elowen, please," Cedric said, taking a step forward. "Don't complicate this further." She raised her hand to stop him. "Don't complicate? Cedric, you already complicated everything when you decided to hide the existence of a child from me. Now let me handle this my way." Cedric opened his mouth to protest but gave up. He knew he had crossed a line. Now all he could do was wait and pray that Elowen would forgive him one day. Sarah's house was small, located on a quiet street in the outskirts of the city. Elowen hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car, gazing at the rusty gate and the simple garden. The contrast between Sarah's world and her own was overwhelming. The life she shared with Cedric felt so distant from this place, yet everything in that moment was intrinsically connected. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure, and knocked on the door. For a few moments, nothing happened. Elowen almost considered going back to the car, but the door finally opened, revealing a woman of simple appearance but dignity. Sarah had tired eyes that seemed to carry the weight of years of struggle, but her posture was firm. She looked at Elowen with surprise, but not hostility. "You must be Elowen," Sarah said in a calm voice filled with resilience. "Yes," Elowen replied, trying to mask her uncertainty. "Can we talk?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, but opened the door a little wider and gestured for her to come in. "Of course, I think it's about time." The interior of the house was cozy, despite its modesty. There were framed photographs of James on the walls, portraits from various stages of his life, a smiling baby, a boy holding a school trophy, a teenager next to a dog. Each image seemed to scream the absence of Cedric. Sarah pointed to the sofa, and Elowen sat down, observing her surroundings. She felt a mix of discomfort and curiosity. This was the house where James had grown up, Sarah's world, so distant from what she knew. "So," Sarah began, sitting in a chair opposite her, crossing her legs calmly, "what do you want to know?" "I want the truth," Elowen said bluntly. "Cedric told me about you and James, but I feel like he didn't tell me everything. I need to understand what happened." Sarah gave a slight smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was the kind of smile from someone who had faced many battles. "Cedric and we were young when we met. He was ambitious, full of plans. I fell in love with him because he had a vision of life I had never seen before. He made me believe that anything was possible." "And when you found out you were pregnant?" Elowen asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I told him immediately," Sarah replied, "and at first he seemed to want to do the right thing. He said we would take care of it together, that he would be there. But then—" She paused, looking at a picture of James on the wall. "Then he met you." Elowen felt the impact of Sarah's words like a cold wave. She waited for Sarah to continue, and the woman did not take long. "When Cedric's father found out about James, he supported him," Sarah said. "But when your father entered the picture, everything changed. Your father was powerful, and he saw Cedric as an important pawn in his game. He offered me money, guaranteed that James and I would be fine. But there was a condition. That you would disappear," Elowen completed, her voice filled with sorrow. Sarah nodded. "I accepted the money because I needed to protect James. I was young, without a solid career, and the money was the only way to ensure he had a decent life. But I never wanted Cedric to disappear from his life. I never wanted to be a shadow." Sarah stood up and walked to a nearby drawer. She returned holding a small wooden box. When she opened it, Elowen saw a pile of letters and envelopes. Some were open, others still sealed. Next to the letters were small toys and gifts for children. "These are the letters and gifts I sent to Cedric over the years," Sarah said, placing the box on the table between them. I tried so hard. I wanted him to be part of James's life, but every time it all came back to me. He returned the letters, the gifts, without saying a word." Elowen picked up one of the letters and opened it, reading the first lines. It was a simple message but full of feeling, describing James's first day of school and how he asked about his father. The knot in her throat tightened. "He chose to ignore it," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "He chose to protect his marriage with you, to protect his image instead of being the father James deserved." "Did you hate him for that?" Elowen asked, still holding the letter. Sarah shook her head slowly. I tried to hate him many times, but deep down I think I always believed he would come back, that he would make the right decision one day. Maybe I was naive, but—" She looked at the photo of James again. "I just wanted my son to have the father he deserved." Elowen felt tears streaming down her face. Everything Sarah said made sense, but that didn't lessen her own pain. Cedric hadn't just betrayed Sarah and James, he had betrayed her trust, building a marriage on foundations of secrets. "I'm so sorry," Elowen said, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm so sorry for everything you went through and for everything James went through." "I don't want your pity, Elowen," Sarah replied gently but firmly. "I just want you to understand. I never wanted to destroy your marriage. I just wanted Cedric to take responsibility, to be the man he promised to be." Elowen looked at Sarah, seeing a woman who, despite everything, still stood tall. There was a strength in Sarah that was admirable, even if it was painful. Elowen knew she needed time to process everything, but one thing was certain. She couldn't ignore the truth. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," Elowen said, rising to her feet. "But I know James deserves more than this. He deserves to be recognized. I promise that as long as it depends on me, he will have that." Sarah nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you for listening and for trying." Elowen left Sarah's house with a heavy heart, but also with a newfound determination. Cedric would have to face the truth, every bit of it, and James would have to be the focus from now on. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was willing to face it. Elowen gripped the steering wheel tightly as the car made its way down the road leading to her parents' house. The sky was grey, reflecting the weight in her chest. Her conversation with Sarah had opened a new wound, but it was her father's role in the story that now gnawed at her from the inside. She needed answers, but above all, she needed to face the man who had shaped her life with manipulation and secrets. As she parked in front of the imposing family home, her heart raced. Everything there seemed untouched by time. The perfectly manicured lawn, the symmetrically arranged garden, the grand facade. But for Elowyn, none of it held the same allure as before. Now, every detail seemed to symbolize control and power disguised as perfection. Elowyn's father welcomed her into the living room, as always, with a rehearsed smile. He was seated in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in hand. Upon seeing her, his face registered surprise. "Daughter," he began, rising to his feet, "it's so good to see you, but you look troubled. Is something wrong?" Elowyn crossed her arms and stood her ground. "Yes, something is wrong, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Her father's smile slowly faded. He looked at her with a hint of discomfort, but still tried to maintain his composure. "Why don't you sit down? We can talk this over calmly." "I'd rather stand," she replied, her voice steady. "I spoke with Cedric, then I spoke with Sarah." Her father didn't move, but Elowyn noticed the slight tightening of his lips. He knew the moment had come. "I want to hear it from you," she continued. "I want you to tell me straight up what you did. I need to know what gave you the right to interfere in Cedric's life, in Sarah's, in James's, and in mine." Her father sighed and set his whiskey glass on the side table. He rubbed his chin before responding, as if carefully choosing his words. "Elowyn," he began, "everything I did was for the good of our family, for your good." "My good?" Elowyn repeated, incredulous. "Do you really think manipulating other people's lives was for my good?" "You don't understand, daughter," he said, rising to his feet. "At that time, Cedric was on the rise, but carrying a burden that could have ruined everything. He was the perfect choice for you, intelligent, ambitious, dedicated. But that woman, Sarah, and the child they had, they were a problem." "A problem?" Elowyn took a step forward, her anger boiling. "They are people, father. People with feelings, lives, dreams. How can you reduce this to a problem?" Her father stared at her, his expression hardening. "Yes, they were a problem. Cedric's connection to them could have tarnished your reputation, could have ruined everything I was trying to build for you. I had to protect you, protect your position." "Position!" Elowyn exploded, her voice echoing through the room. "You didn't protect me. You stole my chance to choose, to know the truth. You placed me in a life built on lies and secrets." "I did what any father would do," he retorted, raising his tone. "I ensured you had a stable future. You think you know how the world works, but you don't. The position you hold, the respect you receive, all of it could have been destroyed if Cedric were exposed with an illegitimate child and a humble woman." "And you think that's an excuse?" Elowyn asked, her voice filled with pain. "You think you can just decide what's best for me without even asking? You think you can play with other people's lives as if they were pieces on a board?" "I did what was necessary," he replied, now colder. "And if you're honest with yourself, you'll see that I was right. You've had a good life, Elowyn. Cedric was a good husband. All I did was ensure that." Elowyn shook her head, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "You are blind, father. You don't see what your manipulation has done. Sarah spent years trying to maintain her dignity while raising a child alone. James grew up without his father because you decided he didn't deserve to be recognized. And I lived a lie. You destroyed more than you built." Elowyn's father seemed uncomfortable for the first time. He averted his gaze but remained silent. Elowyn realized that, despite her initial confidence, he knew his actions had caused irreparable damage. "Elowyn," he finally said, his tone softer, "I understand that you're hurt, but please, believe that I only wanted what was best for you." "You don't understand anything," she replied, her voice firm. "Because if you did, you would know that the best thing for me was the truth. It was having the chance to choose for myself, to know Cedric for who he really is, and not for who you shaped him to fit your idea of perfection." Her father nodded slowly, but there was no regret in his eyes, only acceptance. "So what will you do now?" Elowyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that question. "I will fix what you broke," she said. "Somehow I will mend this, but not for you. Not for Cedric, for me, and for James." As Eloin walked out of the house, she felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Confronting her father had been difficult but necessary. For the first time, she realized how deeply he had influenced her life and how much she needed to break free from his shadow. As she drove back home, a new determination grew within her. She couldn't change the past, but she could control how she would handle the future. Cedric still had a lot to explain. James still needed to be integrated into the family, and she needed to discover who she was outside the constraints her father had placed around her. We're just getting to the heart of the drama, and there's so much more to uncover. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your opinions in the comments section. Your support is crucial for the growth of the channel and helps keep these emotional stories coming. Now let's move forward with Eloin's confrontation with her father. The night was in full swing at the lavish charity gala organized by Eloin's family. The main hall was a masterpiece of opulence, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling and tables adorned with impeccable floral arrangements. The elite of society were present, mingling and toasting in elegant tones, each detail a reflection of the perfection that Eloin's family had cultivated for decades. Eloin circulated among the guests, exchanging smiles and polite phrases, but her heart was far from the festivities. After her confrontation with her father, she had decided to attend the event more to maintain appearances than out of genuine interest. Cedric, impeccably dressed in a black suit, was just a few meters away speaking with a group of investors. To everyone there, they still appeared to be the perfect couple. But Eloin knew that this image was on the brink of collapse. On the other side of the hall, a teenager entered hesitantly. James wore a simple shirt and denim pants, clearly standing out from the sophistication surrounding him. He didn't seem bothered by the curious stares directed at him. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Cedric, and his expression hardened. Eloin was about to approach Cedric when she noticed James. Her heart stopped. What is he doing here? Before she could move, James was already making his way through the crowd, drawing confused looks and whispers. "Who is that boy?" someone asked. "Where did he come from?" James didn't hesitate. When he reached the stage where Cedric was positioned, he grabbed a microphone left behind by one of the organizers. The sound of his breathing filled the speakers, silencing the murmurs. "My name is James," he began, his voice trembling but firm, "and I am Cedric's son." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Cedric, who looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Eloin felt air being sucked from her lungs. She froze, unable to decide whether she should run to protect James or let him continue. "Why didn't you have the courage to call me son?" James continued, now looking directly at Cedric. His voice trembled with emotion, but he didn't waver. "Why did you choose to hide me as if I were a shameful secret? I am your son, and I deserve to be recognized." Cedric stepped forward, his hand raised as if he wanted to interrupt, but his words failed him. His expression shifted between guilt and shock. "You promised my mother you would take care of us," James said, his voice rising. "But all you did was abandon us. You ignored me my whole life while building this perfect image, but I will not be ignored anymore." The hall erupted into frantic whispers. Guests murmured among themselves, trying to piece together the puzzle. Son of Cedric? He never mentioned this. Eloin felt the gaze of the crowd shift to her as well, as if they were waiting for her reaction. Her face burned, and she realized that James's words had shattered the facade of normalcy that she and Cedric had maintained for so long. Cedric finally found his voice. "James, please," he said, stepping forward. "Not here. Let's talk in private." But James didn't move. "You had 16 years to talk to me," he replied, his words sharp as blades. "Now I want everyone to know who you really are." Eloin could no longer bear it. She crossed the crowd and climbed onto the stage, placing herself between James and Cedric. She looked at the teenager, trying to convey calm. "James," she said, her voice firm yet gentle, "I understand why you're doing this, but can we talk in a quieter place, away from these people?" James looked at her, his eyes shining with contained tears. Do you think I wanted to do this like this? I waited years hoping he would have the courage, but he never did. She nodded slowly. I know, and you have every right to be angry, but please let me help you. After what felt like an eternity, James lowered the microphone and nodded. Elowen placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him off the stage. Cedric remained where he was, unable to move or say anything. The judging stares of the crowd burned like fire on his skin. One of the guests, an influential investor, approached him. "Cedric," he said, his tone cutting, "is this true?" Cedric tried to respond, but his voice failed him. Silence was his confession. In the back, Elowen sat next to James in an empty room. He finally let the tears he had been holding back flow, covering his face with his hands. "I just wanted him to see me," he said, his voice muffled. "I just wanted him to acknowledge me." Elowen felt her heart break for him. She took James's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You deserve to be seen, James, and I promise you that this will change. But we need to do this the right way." As chaos still reigned in the hall, Elowen knew her life had irrevocably changed. Cedric's secret had been exposed, and now they would have to deal with the consequences. But for the first time, she felt that she could help James achieve the justice he deserved. The room was in absolute silence. The tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Cedric, Sarah, and James sat on opposite sides, like pieces in a game ready to be moved. Elowen stood in the center, the axis around which everything revolved. Her presence was strong, but her heart raced. She knew that what was to come would define the future for them all. "I called you here because this needs to end," she began, looking at each one of them. Her voice was calm, but carried an authority she had never felt before. This cycle of secrets, lies, and hurt must stop. Cedric looked away while James crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable. Sarah, however, kept her gaze fixed on Elowen, her expression unwavering. Elowen turned to Cedric first. "You've always told me that you did what was necessary to protect this family," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But now it's clear that in trying to protect a facade, you've destroyed what truly mattered." Cedric raised his eyes to her but said nothing. He looked tired, as if the weight of years of secrets was finally crashing down on him. "James deserves more," Elowen continued. "Sarah deserves more. And if you want to continue in this family, you'll have to face the truth and take responsibility, not with excuses, not with checks, with actions." Cedric opened his mouth to respond, but Elowen raised her hand, interrupting him. "I don't want to hear promises, Cedric. I want to see results, because if you don't do this, there will be no more us. Do you understand?" He slowly nodded but couldn't find the words. The impact of his choices was finally reflecting in his weary expression. Elowen then turned to Sarah. "I know that nothing I say can erase what you've been through," she said, her voice softening. "But I want you to know that I admire the strength you've shown all these years. You raised James practically on your own and never gave up. That's something no one can take away from you." Sarah slightly inclined her head, a silent acknowledgement, but didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I'm not here to fight for something I'll never have, Elowen. I don't want the life you have with Cedric. I just want him to be the father James deserves. I just want respect." Elowen nodded. "You will have that, I promise." Finally, Elowen turned to James, who was staring fixedly at the floor. "James," she said, kneeling to be at his level, "I'm so sorry for everything. You should never have had to go through this." James looked up, and Elowen saw tears welling in his eyes. "I just want him to be my dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I just want him to see me, to be there." Elowen placed her hand on his shoulder. "And I will make sure he is." Standing up, Elowen took a deep breath and looked at everyone again. "I want this to be clear for all of you. Cedric, if you want to rebuild this family, you need to start with the truth. You need to embrace James as your son with no more secrets, no more excuses. You need to respect Sarah for the role she has played in his life. Otherwise, we end here. There's no more room for lies." Cedric finally stood up, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I understand," he said, and I will do what it takes. I've made mistakes, many, but I'm ready to fix this." "Words mean nothing now," Eloin replied, crossing her arms. "You need to show." The meeting ended with a silent agreement. Cedric knew there was no more running away. He would need to act, or he would lose everything. James left with Sarah, but not before casting one last look at Cedric, a look that mixed hope with skepticism. Eloin remained behind with Cedric. She faced him, knowing that her decision to stay by his side would entirely depend on how he acted from that moment on. "I hope you understand what's at stake here," she said. "I'm still here, but not for long if you don't show that you've changed." Cedric nodded, finally starting to grasp the gravity of the situation. "I understand, Eloin, I understand." The sound of tires on the gravel road seemed louder than usual to Cedric's ears. He parked the car in front of Sarah's house and sat for a moment, staring at the small building that now felt intimidating. For years, he had avoided this moment, justifying his absence with excuses that he now knew were hollow. But Eloin was right. He needed to face James, not as a secret to be kept, but as his son. Taking a deep breath, Cedric got out of the car. The simple facade of the house felt heavy with unfulfilled memories. He knew this would be a pivotal moment, for James, for himself, and for the family he was desperately trying to save. Sarah answered the door. Her eyes met Cedric's, and she paused for a moment before saying anything. "You came," she said, a mix of surprise and skepticism in her voice. "I thought you would never do this." "I should have come a long time ago," Cedric replied, his voice low. "Can I talk to him?" Sarah studied him for a few seconds before fully opening the door. "He's in his room, but I'll warn you, he doesn't trust you, and rightly so." Cedric nodded. He didn't expect James to trust him, not yet. Climbing the stairs pointed out by Sarah, he felt the weight of each step. When he reached the slightly ajar door, he saw James sitting on the bed, wearing headphones and holding a book. He looked so normal yet so strange, like a younger version of himself, but with eyes that carried the pain of years of abandonment. Cedric knocked lightly on the door. James looked up, and his closed expression clearly showed that he was not impressed by the visit. "What are you doing here?" James asked, without getting up. Cedric entered slowly, leaving the door open behind him. "I came to apologize, and to try to make things right." James laughed, but not in a joyful way. It was a bitter laugh, almost cynical. "Make things right? After 16 years? Do you really think that can be fixed?" "I know I can't erase the past," Cedric said, sitting down in a chair in the corner of the room. "But I want to be honest with you for the first time." James crossed his arms and regarded him. "Honest? Okay, let's hear it." Cedric took a deep breath. "I was cowardly. I chose to protect my reputation, my marriage, instead of being present in your life. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, but all I did was hurt you and your mother." James remained silent, but his gaze was intense, as if he were analyzing every word Cedric spoke. "I was wrong," Cedric continued, his voice wavering, "and I'm here now because I want to try. I don't know if you can forgive me, and I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I want to prove that I can be different. I want to prove that I can be your father." James remained silent for a long moment. He looked at Cedric, his eyes shimmering with the rage and pain he had carried for so long. "You talk pretty," he finally said, "but words mean nothing to me, not after all this." Cedric felt the impact of those words, but he didn't look away. "I understand," he said, "and you're right. Words aren't enough. That's why I want to show you through my actions that I can change, that I want to change." James shook his head, as if he were still processing what he was hearing. "I've heard you say that you cared, that you wanted to fix things, but if that's true, then prove it. Show that I'm more than a secret to you." Cedric felt tears welling up, but held them back. "I will prove it, James. Not with promises, with actions." The conversation didn't end with emotional hugs or declarations of love. There was no instant forgiveness, and Cedric knew it would be a long road. But something had changed. As he stood to leave, James didn't stop him, but he also didn't encourage him. It was a beginning, fragile, but real. Sarah was waiting in the living room, watching Cedric as he descended the stairs. "So, how did it go?" she asked, arms crossed. "He doesn't trust me," Cedric replied, "but I'll do everything I can to earn his trust, I promise." Sarah studied him for a moment before responding. "I hope so, because if you hurt him again, Cedric, I won't forgive you." Cedric nodded, knowing she was right. He left the house feeling a weight lifted, but also with a new responsibility. For the first time, he was determined to be the father that James deserved. Back at home, Elowen waited anxiously for Cedric's return. When he walked in, he looked exhausted, but there was a determination in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. "How did it go?" she asked, trying not to sound anxious. "It was hard," Cedric replied, sitting down next to her, "but necessary. He doesn't trust me, and he shouldn't, but I promised him I would prove my worth, that I would be the father he deserves." Elowen nodded, feeling a slight relief. "That's a start." "Do you think there's still hope for us?" Cedric asked, his voice heavy with vulnerability. Elowen took a deep breath before answering. "That depends on you, on how you act from here on out. It's not too late to change, Cedric, but it needs to be genuine." Spring brought a renewed atmosphere to Elowen and Cedric's home. After months of emotional reconstruction, there was a palpable sense of progress. It wasn't perfect, nor could it be, but it was tangible. James now visited regularly, joining them for dinners and beginning to bond with his younger siblings. Cedric was genuinely making an effort, helping James with schoolwork, attending his soccer games, and, for the first time, publicly stepping into the role of father. Elowen watched all of this with a mix of relief and skepticism. Cedric was trying, but she knew the true test would be the consistency of his actions. Still, there was something comforting about seeing James smile and feel part of something bigger. Even with the scars of the past, the family was beginning to find a new sense of unity. That evening, the family gathered for a special dinner. Cedric had prepared James's favorite dish, something he had recently learned as a gesture of connection. Everyone chatted casually at the table, laughing and sharing stories. Elowen felt strangely at peace. For the first time in months, the tension that had hung over them seemed to dissipate. James was more at ease, and Cedric appeared a different man, more present, more human. After dinner, while everyone was in the living room, Elowen began to tidy up the kitchen. While picking up a stack of papers from the counter, she noticed an envelope with her initial, E, written by hand by Cedric. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won. She opened the envelope and began to read. "Elowen, I'm not good with spoken words. Even when I try to express how I feel, I end up stumbling or falling silent. That's why I'm writing this letter. It's something I've kept to myself for years, and I think you deserve to know." Elowen felt the weight of his words immediately. Cedric had never been one for spontaneous confessions, but there, in his careful handwriting, was something that felt more honest than any conversation they had ever had. "Before I met Sarah, before I met you, I was lost. My career was just beginning, but the challenges consumed me. There were times when I thought about giving everything up. I felt small, insignificant. It was during that time that I met your father. He saw me in a way that no one else did. He told me I had potential, but that I needed discipline, vision, and focus. He wasn't gentle, Elowen. He was tough, even cruel at times, but he gave me a chance." Elowen paused in her reading, feeling a tightening in her chest. Cedric's words painted a picture of her father that she had never considered. She resumed reading. "Your father invested in me when no one else believed I could succeed. He made sacrifices for you, yes, but also for me. He gave me something that no one else had, purpose. And when he introduced me to you, he told me something I've never forgotten. She is your chance to build something real. Don't mess this up." The letter continued. "I know many of your father's decisions were wrong. I know he hurt you, but I want you to understand that without him, I wouldn't be the man I am today. He gave me the courage I needed, even if the price was far too high." Elowen felt tears silently streaming down her face. For the first time, she could see her father's motivations in a different light. He wasn't just a manipulator. He was a man trying to protect and shape a future for her, even if his methods were flawed. When she finished reading, Elowen felt a wave of conflicting emotions. There was pain, anger, and strangely a sense of understanding. Her father's sacrifice, though imperfect, had shaped the lives of everyone there. He had created a bridge between her and Cedric, even if it was built on secrets. Elowen tucked the letter into her pocket and returned to the living room, where Cedric was chatting with James about plans for the upcoming weekend. Watching the two interact, she realized how much everyone had changed. Cedric looked over at her and smiled. "Is everything okay?" he asked with a hint of concern. Elowen nodded, holding back her emotions. "Yes," she replied, "everything is okay." That night, as they prepared for bed, Elowen moved closer to Cedric and hugged him. He was surprised but returned the embrace tenderly. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" he asked. "For trying," she replied, "for being here." Cedric held her tighter, saying nothing. They still had a long road ahead, but for the first time there was hope. Cedric's letter brought a clarity Elowen hadn't expected. Her father had been a man full of flaws, but also full of love. He had made difficult decisions to protect those he loved, even if it meant carrying the burden of being misunderstood. In the end, Elowen realized that love, sacrifice, and redemption came in many forms, some more complicated than others. The future was uncertain, but she knew she had the strength to face it. And as she looked at Cedric and James, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of hope. And so, Elowen, Cedric, James, and Sarah begin to forge a new path, rebuilding bonds that once seemed broken beyond repair. This story teaches us that the truth, no matter how painful, has the power to free and heal. Elowen learned that love and sacrifice aren't always perfect, but can guide our actions in unexpected ways. Cedric discovered that redemption is only possible when we face our mistakes head-on and choose the harder path, honesty. And James proved that it's never too late to demand the love and recognition we deserve. How many times in life have you wondered if protecting someone means hiding the truth? And how do we deal with the sacrifices made in the name of love? Share your thoughts on this story in the comments and tell us your reflections. Your opinion matters so much. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments section. This really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss the next emotional stories we'll bring your way. And before you go, click on the end screen card to watch the next recommended video. You're going to love it. Thank you for staying with us until the end and being part of this journey. See you next time.